Want to welcome everybody this evening. Good to see you all again. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Want to again say hello as we gather for this fourth and final Zoom gathering in our 5-week Lenten journey with Pope Francis, where tonight we look for a better kind of politics and a friendship in society. Our scripture reading for tonight is from Corinthians 13 and talks about faith, hope, and love, with the greatest being love. And so I'd like to begin this evening with a story that talks about, it's an empathetic kind of love, not just a sympathetic smile or wave kind of love, but a walk a mile in my shoes kind of love. So this guy's walking down a street when he falls in a hole. The walls are so steep that he can't get out. A doctor passes by and the guy shouts up, "Hey, can you help me out?" The doctor writes a prescription, throws it down the hole, and moves on. Then a priest comes along and the guy shouts up, "Father, I'm down in this hole. Can you help me get out?" The priest writes out a prayer, throws it down in the hole, and moves on. Then a friend walks by. "Hey, Joe, it's me. Can you help me out?" And the friend jumps in the hole with him. Now our guy says, "What's wrong with you? Now we're both down here." And the friend says, "Yeah, but I've been down here before and I know the way out." Been here before and know the way out. Someone who's willing to share life with you, someone who's willing to help no matter the cost, and jump down in that hole with you because I've been there before and we can work it out together. And that's the kind of dialogue and friendship and love that we're talking about. Now I'd like to turn to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for our prayer reflection for this evening. He wrote something called Jericho Road. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. We are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. Compassion sees that an edifice that produces beggars needs restructuring. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. Let us pray. Ever-present God, you called us to be in relationship with one another and promised to dwell wherever 2 or 3 are gathered. In our community, we are many different people. We come from many different places, have many different cultures. Open our hearts that we may be bold in finding the riches of inclusion and the treasures of diversity among us. We pray in faith. Amen. Well, this evening we'll be exploring chapters 5 and 6 of Fratelli Tutti, where our Holy Father cites St. John Paul II, imagining a nobler sort of politics that puts social love at the forefront rather than economics. Political love is practiced in sacrifice for those in greatest need, but also in accord with subsidiarity so that it does not become a soulless pragmatism. Politics should focus on the long-term common good. In chapter 6, Pope Francis turns to dialogue and its essential role in creating a new culture of fraternity. Dialogue is a middle path between selfish indifference and violent protest. Society is built on authentic dialogue, which involves respecting the other's viewpoint. but not in a relativistic fashion. It must respect the truth of our human dignity and submit to the truth. This is lived out in the hard but joyful work of encountering those who are different than ourselves. For this, we can call on the Holy Spirit for the gift of kindness. This evening, I'd like to first welcome and introduce you to Mr. Jeff Campbell. Jeff serves as director of the Catholic Commission of Summit County, part of the Diocesan Social Action Office and Catholic Charities for the Diocese of Cleveland. His main roles include sharing Catholic social teaching with local parishes and schools, engaging Catholics in ministries and initiatives serving the poor and vulnerable, and building solidarity and advocacy on issues impacting Catholic social teaching in society. 4 years prior to Summit, Jeff worked as director of the Catholic Commission of Wayne, Ashland, Medina, and Diocesan Rural Life Outreach. He served in the Social Action Office for nearly 12 years, including 7 years previously with the Catholic Action Commission of Lorain County. From 2008 to early 2015, he served as Parish Social Mission Director at a vibrant Jesuit parish in Cincinnati, where he supported the parish's integration of faith, discipleship, respect life, justice, solidarity, and care for creation. Jeff has worked over 25 years in faith formation and Catholic social teaching ministry. He graduated summa cum laude from the University of Dayton, a Catholic and Marianist university in Dayton, Ohio, with majors in history, urban studies, and Catholic social ethics. He grew up in nearby Canton and has called Northeast Ohio most of his life. So we welcome Jeff. Thank you for being with us here tonight.
Thanks, Rita.
Turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everybody. Let's see. So tonight we're looking at chapters 5 and 6, A Better Kind of Politics and Dialogue and Friendship in Society. Keeping in mind last week, the chapters 3 and 4, engendering, let's see, what we call, engendering and envisioning an open world and a heart open to the whole world. So we just want to keep those in mind, because in these two chapters, if you might recall from your reading, as Pope Francis tries to describe a better kind of politics, he's also challenging our personal and social imaginations to believe in what could be possible, because not just of a political ideology of one sort or another, or of any kind at all, but directly from the heart of our faith, directly from the heart and love of God, from the heart and love of Christ, from God's love made real in this life in human flesh in the person of Jesus Christ. So if that's our starting point, Pope Francis will end up bursting a lot of our bubbles about what we think is important in terms of the context of American society and politics, or US politics and society. He's also going to burst a few of our bubbles in terms of what we think is important in our own lives, because he challenges us in terms of chapter 4, a heart open to the world. If a heart is truly open to the world, it will choose voluntarily, lovingly, generously to make some sacrifices, to make some accommodations, to make room for others. And then I love that phrase that's been used a number of times in Fratelli Tutti and in the previous presentations, that phrase that Pope Francis uses frequently, without borders. Keep that in mind, because it's a little bit of a play on words in some ways, because he points out the challenges in our day and age about immigration, and how that's one of the key challenges about how open are our hearts to the world if we aren't open to immigrants. How open is our society if we aren't open to welcoming newcomers who are trying to flee violence, human rights abuses, and pursuing better opportunities, or just any opportunity for their family and their livelihood. So it's a play on also our image about borders in terms of division of people and those who would want to keep out immigrants, foreigners, refugees, and asylum seekers. But it's also about what happens in our very own hearts in our very own minds, in our very own thinking processes, also in our personal politics and in our national politics and our civil discourse. Because look at all the borders. If we took just a moment and we had you list, if we did the exercise, but we'll do it mentally, if you just listed all the things that you would say are a border between one person or another, between one racial demographic and another, between one political party and another, even between different segments of Catholics, sometimes in our own parishes where we see Catholics who see themselves as, I'm a right to life Catholic, and that's most important to me. And others who would say, well, I'm a peace and justice Catholic, and that's what's really important, and a consistent ethic of life. So even within our own church, we have some borders, some boundaries, some barriers and obstacles. So Pope Francis uses a series of terms about a faith without borders, a love without borders, and a prayer without borders. So keep that in mind tonight as we talk about a better kind of politics, because he talks about a way of going about national relations and also international relations that tries to not do away with all borders. He mentions again and again, and Catholic social teaching recognizes the inherent sovereignty of nation states. So nobody's trying to trample on the sovereignty of the United States here. Nobody's talking about one super overarching world government, but he's talking about reducing the borders and the obstacles within ourselves and in our attitudes and views of others, especially the poor, the vulnerable, the foreigner, the stranger, the outcast, the different, those who are seen as different because of either lifestyle or certain aspects of their lives. So I'm going to go through several pages here. If you have your document pulled up on your computer screen, or if you have it printed out, that you've made your own notes in your reading, although the versions that we have, I don't have page numbers in my version, so I guess I'll try to refer to the section heading as best I can. Well, actually the paragraph number, that's the easiest way. And also, since he talks about encouraging our personal and social and spiritual imaginations, picture that I came up with these wonderful PowerPoint slides tonight that I just didn't have time to pull together. And so I have these marked down in terms of the slides that I would have done, about 7 or 8 slides that I would have done. And I'm going to walk through these. And as I do this, I'm also going to add a little bit of context, because Pope Francis, if you recall from just 5 years ago, he issued another encyclical called Laudato Si. And who else? And none other than the patron of Laudato Si, same as for Fratelli Tutti, was St. Francis of Assisi, his own namesake in his papacy, and very intentionally chosen, right? So when it comes to being in solidarity with God's creation, caring for and sustaining God's creation for the good of the world, for the good of humanity, not just as ideological environmentalists, but for the good of God's creation and for the good of humanity, he wrote Laudato Si to call us to care for God's creation in a phrase that he used, integral ecology, also combined with the term integral human development. And in chapter 5, those phrases are basically implied in every single paragraph he's referring to. So I give that as a little bit of context. In some of his other writings, especially in Joy of the Gospel, where Pope Francis talks a lot about missionary discipleship, I tend to boil Joy of the Gospel, Evangelium Gaudium, down into three, what I refer to as kind of the 3 parts of missionary discipleship. Discipleship with passionate and joyful discipleship in Jesus Christ, or passionate discipleship in Jesus Christ, joyful evangelization, which means recognizing our own conversion story and love story with God and Christ, and being able to tell that in creative and meaningful, heartfelt ways to others. And then, discipleship, evangelization, and then social mission. So discipleship, evangelization, and social mission are 3 important and inherent parts of this pursuit that we're in right now, and have been really since Pope St. John Paul II, where he kind of launched that initiative about the new evangelization that has now been kind of translated and presented in the church and talked about in many of our parishes as pursuing and forming intentional disciples, or forming missionary disciples. So keep that in mind as well. Discipleship, evangelization, and social mission. So these chapters really get at the social mission part of it, but all in the context of our discipleship, because it's not separate. In the Joy of the Gospel, he talks a lot about a key term that in our American context, we would easily misunderstand. and in a very limiting way, and that's the term charity. The global church talks about charity in terms of caritas. Pope Francis is very, very specific about how we translate the term caritas, or the word caritas. In our American context, we think of charity as, how much do I give to nonprofit organizations and service organizations and service and outreach ministries? How generous am I with my time or my presence to others? How much time do I spend at church and out in the community and civic organizations? So all of those certainly are relevant to the larger definition of our American notion of charity, but caritas, and then others who might specifically look at caritas in the context of the church's tradition and teaching, might translate caritas simply as love. That's true as well, but only part of the definition of love, because the implied definition of caritas is it's an active love. As Rita mentioned in her introduction, it's a compassion that is very determined and intentional in its support and advocacy and accompaniment of the other, of the poor, the neglected, the widow, the orphan, the leopard, all those who are biblically poor sisters and brothers in the reign of God. And so if love is an active love, Pope Francis then prefers to describe caritas, or translate caritas, as works of love or acts of love. So it's not just this ephemeral love. For instance, actually, one thing that he in some ways infers in chapters 5 and 6 in parts is he talks about both the universal and the specific, both the global and the local. And so there's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek joke about love that says, well, I love humanity, but it's people I don't like. And in the church's teaching and in the gospel and our life in Christ, that's not a possible dichotomy. We both love humanity and we love the person in front of us, even if it's a person that we perhaps feel a bit averse to or different from, or perhaps even very, very opposed to on certain ideas. But we aren't opposed to their humanity and their dignity. So last week also touched on Catholic social teaching. So I'll refer to a few of the themes very briefly in Catholic social teaching that pop up here again in chapters 5 and 6. But one of the purposes and methods of Catholic social teaching is Catholic social teaching always seeks to humanize and transform. Anything that dehumanizes and deforms or minimizes or degrades society, anything that dehumanizes or minimizes or degrades or diminishes society and the human person, is contrary to Catholic social teaching and contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So remember that Catholic social teaching is always trying to humanize and transform. And I mention that because that's also a large context here. So if we keep in mind that caritas is not just a simple American idea of charity, nor a simple notion of love, but it's acts of love and works of love. And then also that Catholic social teaching and its emphasis and its methods always try to emphasize that which humanizes and transforms. One other term that I'll mention also borrows a little bit from last week, and that's with hearing from Sister with the Akron Catholic Worker House. A key aspect of Dorothy Day's approach to the Catholic worker outlook or philosophy is Christian personalism. I don't know if everybody's heard that term or not, but really it's how Christ would end up saying that even in the role of Christian community, every person is important because every person has inherent human dignity, has that inherent respect for human life. And therefore, everybody is made uniquely in the image and likeness of God, but uniquely so to the point where the world would be far different and far worse off without any of us, even the least and the poorest person in the world, or the poorest community, the poorest neighborhood. So Christian personalism, last week we heard some reference to presence and relationships, such as the stories from Honduras about the importance of being together, being there, seeing their smile, seeing their face, looking a person in the eye, looking the children in the eye to absorb and feel their humanity. Also, in the gospel, the term compassion, I don't know if anybody has, in any Bible studies, has read a little bit about the use of the word compassion, and in the story, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, and in a few other parables or passages as well. But compassion literally means to rend one's to rend one's interior, to rend one's intestines in some ways, which means that if we are to love and to be merciful like God the Father, one of those passages in Scripture, be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful, and we to respond with compassion. Who is my neighbor? Well, the one who responded with compassion. Or who was neighbor to the person on the side of the road? The one who responded with compassion and mercy, which means we're called to actually feel a movement or a rending or even a wrenching inside that leads us to feel deeply the plight of the other, because that could be us. So a little bit of background there, and then I'll get through these slides here fairly quickly. And then Rita, if you want to put in the chat, if I get within a couple minutes of kind of when we need to move on, then just let me know. So maybe give me a 5-minute warning or something. But so anyway, so the first slide I would have come up with, if we're picturing these wonderful slides that I would have done in this alternative dimension, I would have started with some of that right there, translating caritas, remember, works of love, acts of love. And at the bottom of, in paragraphs 164 and 165, Pope Francis says a little bit more about this caritas. Now, in our English translation here, it's simply worded as charity in paragraph 164. But if you notice in paragraph 165, he talks about true charity. So he's really trying to get at this translation of caritas, this very pivotal translation of caritas. True charity is capable of incorporating all these elements in its concern for others. And above that talks about just, like I mentioned about the term compassion, about this deep rending of experiencing and feeling for the plight of others. What he presumes, or what he proposes, that our politics is very unlikely to change unless we're moved to that extent by compassion, by this common humanity with the other, by not just sympathy, but a deeply rooted empathy, but integrated with very deeply rooted love. Then as he builds on what he's trying to propose about true charity, caritas, works of love, he also proposes, and last week we did have a wonderful explanation about Christian personalism, the story of the starfish along the seashore, along the beach. And even in the presentation about Honduras, that same phrase was mentioned. It matters to this one child, this one community, this one person. But Pope Francis challenges us to then write large this vision of love, that love is called to also be not just between one person and another, but also social, meaning it reaches out to communities, it reaches out to our wider culture, it reaches out to the entire world ultimately. And again, that's what he would argue in his previous chapters, is what he means by a love without borders, a love that is capable of loving universally. And again, what he's arguing here is that our politics will not change unless our love reaches a broader level. So then he begins to talk about social charity and political charity, and the term political love. Now, in our American context, you might think, well, geez, in politics, where is their charity and where is their love? In our Catholic vision of politics and social relationship, love and charity are everything. In Catholic social teaching, politics is, and he refers to it a little bit later in chapter 6, that politics is the art of encounter, that politics and society are the art of encounter. So there must be, in our Catholic vision, something different about social relationships and politics. In living missionary discipleship, Pope Francis is calling us to be a leaven in society. But unfortunately, too often society and our default minimalistic and combative form and divisive form of politics, too often that's what impresses upon and seeps into the church, and it divides us as Catholics. It divides one Christian, it can even divide Christian denominations against one another because of perhaps some of the perceived political leanings of their particular faith teachings. But the US bishops, and every 4 years, their presidential election year statement, Faithful Citizenship, they're very, very specific to point out how Catholic social teaching is neither left nor right, neither liberal nor conservative, neither Democrat nor Republican. They even admit that neither party has a monopoly in any way whatsoever on Catholic social teaching. And they point out that every Catholic has the right to feel politically homeless in terms of our national politics, the way that it's played out, because our choices are so limited, and each party at the national level resorts to, certain interests at times, that it makes it hard to trust what the true motivations are and whether either party really does try to serve and pursue the common good for all of us. Because we live in a politics of personal destruction, character assassination, that's very counter to this idea of encounter, charity, caritas, and love, and dialogue. So let's try to get at then, and picturing the next slide here about social charity and political love. With social charity, Pope Francis acknowledges that Catholic social teaching actually first and foremost proposes justice as our response to those in need, to the poor, to society. Actually, there are phrases from many of the saints and wisdom figures in the church and past centuries of Catholic teaching that talk about how what is owed to the poor is first due in the form of justice, meaning we try to structure and build up a society that is fair and just to the poor and to every last person. And then whatever the gaps are, we're to fill those gaps with our Christian outreach and service and charity. In some ways, in the church in the last number of years of this past century, that's kind of flipped itself on its head, and especially in our American context, because we seem first and foremost to lean on the call to Christian charity, the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. And we seem a bit more averse to the call to justice. There are some political media or some opinion political media that try to denigrate the term justice. I've even heard some political pundits who have said, if you hear your church or your pastor using the term social justice, run. But the church is very comfortable with talking the language of social justice because it knows what it means by it. It doesn't mean any particular political ideology or political leaning. It talks about, actually, and it's a term used in chapter 5, building a civilization of love. And if your political affiliation does not lead you in terms of your demeanor, your dialogue, your rhetoric, your time on social media, your commentaries to others, and the way that you vote and the candidates and policies and issues you support, if that's not leading to a civilization of love, if it's leading to one party's primacy over and above the other at all costs, no matter what the fallout and the damage may be, then I'm sorry to say, and I think Pope Francis would support this statement, that might be a little bit blunt, but Pope Francis, I believe, would argue that then whoever is living in that way is not supporting building a civilization of love, and is actually acting in some ways that are, falling short of the call of the gospel and our life in Jesus Christ and Catholic social teaching. So social charity then would lead us to then an opening of heart, as chapter 4 pointed out, but also an opening to imagination and creativity. And so instead of falling into these default modes of one party or political ideology and one platform over another, Pope Francis says that we're called to a passionate pursuit of the common good. So a civilization of love and a passionate pursuit of the common good. If we don't open our hearts to the world, if we aren't open to the poor, if we aren't open to those with whom we might even politically disagree, and even somewhat, passionately at times, which is okay. And he acknowledges that in chapters 5 and 6. If we don't open ourselves in that way, we won't also have the social imagination to bring people together where we can imagine what he recommends as new structures, new programs, and new projects. And he even refers to in paragraph 169, he refers to popular movements of alternative social programs. Popular movements of alternative social programs, because he's trying to get at that which helps build a new society that has the means of dignity, livelihood, usefulness, and contribution and participation for all people. One of the first few themes of Catholic social teaching is the call to community, called to family, community, and participation. The poor are often among the first to be left out of participation, community and participation. They're often pushed to the margins. Their perspectives are also often disregarded as, well, what do you know? Because if you were more successful, if you were more educated, then you could contribute more to society. But the poor are experts of their own experience. And in Joy of the Gospel, Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation from several years ago, he points out that the poor are among our greatest evangelizers. He even goes on to say some of the greatest evangelizers in his life have been the poor themselves. And he continues to go on and to say, for the poor have much to teach us. And isn't that true throughout much of the gospel? Jesus actually pauses in certain encounters, the woman at the well and others who say, Jesus, why won't you do this? And then they challenge him a little bit. Do you not preach about the love of God and the reign of God for all people? And then he responds to the woman at the well, woman, you have spoken rightly. Therefore, go, your sins are forgiven. And then she goes on as a disciple and evangelizer to go and witness to her village about this forgiveness and this encounter that she had with Jesus. So she actually prompted a woman who's poor in his day, prompted him to kind of change his view in that moment and respond more fully. So alternative programs of social progress and popular movements. He points out in that section about the importance for employment. Now, he's not saying that that is the most important political issue or social and moral issue, but what he's pointing about is how pivotal it is to participation in society. Because if the poor are without work, if there aren't reasonable means, but now if there aren't reasonable means for them gaining employment, but then in our American political context, we think back to under the Clinton administration about welfare to work reform. One of the challenges of that reform, and the U.S. bishops talked about this quite significantly. So I'm not just speaking my own personal political preference, but I'm citing the U.S. bishops. Is they pointed out how job opportunities under that welfare to work reform were actually very, very limited. Some of the job opportunities were provided for people were either they were either at risk of being cut off from public assistance, or they had to clean out the trash cans of the social workers at Job and Family Services. That's not exactly a motivating, socially uplifting, dignifying, and humanizing and transforming experience. Now, it is something. So these alternative social programs are what Pope Francis calls us to social charity, so that we can conceive of, imagine, and try to put into place and support programs that really do empower and change and transform the lives of the poor. So for instance, locally, if you haven't heard of South Street Ministries and Front Porch Cafe, I encourage you to look them up. If we had more time, I would show you these websites. I'd show you where they're at on a map, but in the Summit Lake neighborhood, just south of the 77 lateral, just below downtown, sits a small building that does big things for people in the neighborhood and for the youth in the neighborhood. And they also wanted to form jobs because they'd have a significant outreach for formerly incarcerated persons. For returning citizens who have come out of jail and incarceration, and who often are among the hardest, have the hardest time finding jobs in the community because they're among the first to be looked down upon for whether they can work reliably and with trust or not. And so they founded this Front Porch Cafe. They have fantastic cookies. They do a great catering job for large pasta dishes and meals. So it's a great place to go for brunch or lunch. And then your wait staff and your cooks, they're all folks who have served time in jail, but they're trying to get their lives back on track. And then the late afternoon, when the storefront closes down, they're there for their AA meetings, their NA meetings, and they're committed to changing their lives. In the Middlebury neighborhood on the east side of Route 8 is the Well CDC, Community Development Corporation. And they have, why am I blanking on their coffee shop now? If somebody thinks of it, put it in the chat. But they have a coffee shop in the back of their storefront. It's an old, I believe, United Methodist Church, I think. And so they're providing jobs to people in the neighborhood. Compass Cafe, thank you. In Cleveland, on the east side of Cleveland, in Shaker Heights at Shaker Square, a very nice social district. There's a restaurant called Edwin's, stands for Education Wins. And the founder, Brandon Krastowski, served time in jail as a young adult, was introduced to a culinary training program in jail. And the chef told him that if you work hard, I'll show you everything that I can to get started in the culinary world. And he went on from jail and was introduced to chefs in Chicago, then New York, then Paris, and became his own chef. He managed some of the finer restaurants on the east side of Cleveland near University Circle and other neighborhoods. And then, but his dream was always to save up enough money and to have a vision for starting a restaurant that would only hire returning citizens coming out of jail. The only person on their staff who is not a returning citizen is their development director. So he's the general manager of the restaurant. And then when I worked in Wayne Ashland Medina for the Catholic Commission of Wayne Ashland Medina, I spoke with the assistant general manager at Edwin's and also some folks in local county government in Medina to point out that with the opioid crisis, there was a huge need for jobs for people who were in recovery, but also ended up running into problems with law enforcement, incarceration. And so the county sheriff, Tom Miller, a Catholic and a parishioner at St. Ambrose Church in Brunswick, and also the director of Medina County Mental Health and Recovery Board talked to Edwin's, and they founded out in Medina, in the old Medina Steakhouse, they founded Serenity Cafe, and they only hire people who are in recovery and have had trouble with the law and are trying to get back on their feet. And it's a wonderful program and a great restaurant and great food. We need programs like that left and right. And actually, maybe that's a little bit of a pun there, left and right, because part of why those programs are so important is if somebody is of perhaps a politically conservative leaning and they don't believe that government should support every single initiative out there, well, those are privately supported initiatives, right? But they're changing people's lives and they're empowering the poor. They're giving people the dignity and decency of work and a livelihood. If your political leanings are a little bit more progressive, if you care about responsible social policy and compassionate outreach for the poor and opportunities for the poor, those programs suit you as well. So that is one type of program that can really bring us together. And that's part of why Pope Francis encourages these alternative social programs for social uplift. I see that I'm running a little bit short on time. So two last things here then. So political love. So then with social charity, he wants us to escalate love into our political life, which seems averse in many ways to our American politics because it's so combative. But we need everyday Americans, especially people of faith, to be independent-minded enough to challenge people from both parties, to say that we deserve better leadership, that each party falls short of really truly serving the common good, and that many, many politicians seem to give up what they say is this faith life that they hold dear that informs their politics, but yet it seems to go out the door when it comes to running into disagreement with the people across the political aisle from them. So that type of political division only ends up dividing us as fellow Catholic Christians in our parishes. It only ends up dividing us as neighbors, people in our own neighborhoods who sometimes feel like we can't live alongside each other. So we need political love. So the last thing that I'll mention then is getting into chapter 6 about dialogue. And I'll just mention a couple of quick things here. Actually, at the very end of chapter 5 in section 190, he mentions the beginnings of dialogue. And these descriptions here, an openness to everyone, sacrifices that foster encounter, seeking convergence, listening to other points of view, making room for everyone, respect for others, welcoming differences, and the fundamental dignity of all people. In the process of that, he points out just above that two important issues that we all could work on and find agreement on about trying to end hunger, eliminating hunger in the world, and also about human trafficking. He points those out as very pressing issues in our day that have the potential for significant common ground in our community and also at the national and international levels. The two things that I'll mention here about dialogue in chapter 6, he starts out pointing out how we've become, in developed society, we've become so addicted to social media. And we've done it in a way that does not fulfill its more ennobling purposes. It's kind of, reverting to the least common denominator and to our baser self-interests. And by having that kind of, computerized digital media, we seem to be in the process of dehumanizing each other. And remember what I said about Catholic social teaching in the gospel, it's always intended to humanize and transform. And how often is social media used in a way that dehumanizes and diminishes our society and our civil dialogue? Let's see. So he challenged us to use communication to right purpose, to be more aware of pursuing the truth in media and communication. He doesn't have, any political leaning there, where he talks about, he doesn't compare one media to the other and says, well, this is the real fake media and this is not. But he just asks us all to be more discerning, more charitable, and to be more committed to a common, mutually agreed upon pursuit of truth. Mutually agreed upon pursuit of truth. Then I also would point out that towards the end, where does he point it out? At the beginning, right at the last paragraph of chapter 5 that leads into chapter 6, I would argue that he gives us in the examination of conscience from St. Ignatius of Loyola, I would say he gives us an examen of social charity. So I would encourage you to actually pray about paragraph 197. It would make for a wonderful prayer card that combines with the prayers at the end of Fratelli Tutti. He asks us these questions, and these are healthy questions to ask the rest of this series and Lent and moving forward. Significant questions that we must ask ourselves are the real and potentially painful questions we must ask ourselves will be, how much love did I put into my work? What did I do for the progress of our people and of all people? What mark did I leave on the life of society? What real bonds did I create? What positive forces did I unleash and encourage? How much social peace did I sow? What good did I achieve in the position that was entrusted to me? So in dialogue then, he talks about the importance of a social covenant, and that's in section 218. And then lastly, the last 3 sections, he talks a great deal about kindness, the importance of kindness, really basic decency, but love in the particular. Because if you've ever heard the phrase, truth without love offends, and love without truth deceives. And either of those, truth or love, if they're without kindness, they're also a form of deceit. They're also, then less complete or less accurate. So he says, yet even then, even in the face of great injustice, even in the face of divisiveness or aggressive behavior and rhetoric, we can still choose to cultivate kindness. He says, kindness would necessitate that we help make other people's lives more bearable, especially by sharing the weight of their problems, their needs, and their fears. It also involves speaking words of comfort, strength, consolation, encouragement, and not words that demean, sadden, anger, or show scorn. Kindness frees us from the cruelty that at times infects human relationships. And oftentimes nowadays we find neither the time nor the energy to stop and be kind to others. And he ends with, if we make a daily effort to do exactly this, we can create a healthy social atmosphere in which misunderstandings can be overcome and conflict forestalled. Kindness ought to be cultivated, precisely because it entails esteem and respect for others. Once kindness becomes a culture within society, it transforms lifestyles, relationships, and the ways ideas are discussed and compared. In other words, it makes dialogue possible. So thank you, and hopefully those reflections are meaningful for you going ahead in the series in Lent and as we proceed on to Rita's remarks.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you for wonderful words, and thank you for a lot of concrete mentioning these places that we can go to and all of that. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to welcome and introduce Mrs. Rita Rochford. I think a lot of us know Rita. She's been a magistrate in Summit County Juvenile Court since January of 2003. She presides over delinquency and dependency, neglect, and abuse cases. Prior to joining the court, she was a criminal prosecutor for 8 years, in-house counsel to a European manufacturer, and an adjunct professor at the University of Akron. Her community activism includes her membership on a commission formed by former Cleveland Catholic Diocese Bishop Anthony Pilla, where she was charged with rendering recommendations to the diocese for a policy concerning child sexual abuse. Rita has also served on the Battered Women's Shelter Board of Trustees and remains active with the St. Vincent de Paul Parish Board and the Executive Board of the Christ Child Society of Akron. She chairs the Social Justice Commission for our parish. Rita and her husband have been parishioners of St. Vincent for over 35 years, and they have 4 adult children. Rita, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. Can everybody hear me all right? And just shake your head since you're all muted. Okay, great. So I was asked to speak about civic engagement. And I have to tell you, I kind of smiled as I wrote this because my mother, for those of you, some of you might have known my mother, she was a force to be reckoned with. And she was a big believer that if you didn't do something, who was going to do it? And so, you know, as little kids, I can't tell you how many envelopes we licked at the, you know, whatever political committee she had us working on, how many doors that we knocked on, or literature, how many times we piled into the, station wagon with the third bench seat looking out to march on Washington or down Market Street. We tutored at the Martin Luther King Center in Akron, which doesn't exist anymore, when we were in junior high and high school. And I would tell you, these experiences are not only helpful for the community, but they're very impactful to you. I think when I was in high school, we worked at a mission in Vanceboro, Kentucky over the summer. And that was the first time that I realized how much poverty was, 4 hours away from me, and how little health care was available to people who lived in, the Appalachian region. And that has impacted me to this day, that we live in a country where there's so much for some people and then so little for others. I always think it's also says a lot about me. I have 5 brothers and now I have 4 daughters. And I feel like that says a lot about me and makes you understand why I love juvenile court so much. Civic engagement is trying to address issues of public concern, common good. We have tried to instill in our own daughters that the common good is, just so important. And we try not to make individual decisions. For those of us, and many of you also have more than one child, any given day, any given child is the most important. You spend your time and energy on any given child who's in need. Any other given day, it might be the other child. And that's kind of like how I look at the kids at juvenile court and how I look at the community. On any given day, this issue is more important than the next issue. I also believe that lives are sequential, and the things I did as a young person, or while I was in college, or while my kids were little, are different than what we do now. When our kids were little, first of all, we had no money because we had a million kids. And so we did a lot more with our time than we did with our treasure, because our treasure was small. We also were more concerned with the things that concerned our children. So we were very active in the grade school. We were always active in the church. And as they got to high school, we kind of transitioned to high school and were more involved in the high school things. And now our kids are adults. I have to say, I struggle with our church at times. As I have told, I sit on our parish council, and I've said this to council. I have 4 daughters. And part of our mission statement is, that we're a welcoming community. But, when we get statements out of Rome, like we got on Monday, regarding the LGBTQ community, you wonder how welcoming our church really is. And I struggle with that, because I struggle with walking through the doors of a church that my children don't feel welcome in all the time, that their friends don't feel welcome in. Growing up, we boycotted everything. I felt like, we did not have grapes. We did not have lettuce. We were in support of Cesar Chavez. I don't know how long I was married before my husband finally said, Cesar Chavez got a living wage for his people. We can have salads now with dinner. because that's just the way, we didn't shop. We didn't shop in stores when I was younger if they had armed security guards, because my mother always felt that we did not support stores that thought their stuff was more important than shooting someone over. And that's just kind of was normal to me. And so we live that way. And yet I walk through the doors of a church on Sundays. Now I do it virtually, who has policies that I don't find welcoming, and that is hard. But I also believe that all change comes from within, and that it's important to voice these feelings that you have to try to push your church in a way that you feel is more welcoming. Back in 2001, I was a stay-at-home mom pretty much. I was teaching at Akron U at night, but I was pretty much a stay-at-home mom. And it was probably 2000. And I read in the paper that Bishop Pilla was looking for panel members to sit on the commission to look at the issues of the child sexual abuse in the Cleveland diocese. And I thought, Akron is the largest, I believe, the largest geographic area in Ohio that doesn't have its own diocese. And I often feel like I sat on the Summit County CYO board for a while. And I often felt like we're not often held in the esteem that I think Summit County and Akron should be held in the diocese. And so I thought, I'm going to apply for this panel. I was a former prosecutor at the time. I'd been a prosecutor for 8 years, and I had left to stay home with children. And I thought, I'm going to apply. And part of me wondered if the bishop had already picked the people he wanted on the commission, whether it was going to be a fair commission. And when I mean fair, I mean fairly representative of professionals that deal with this issue. And darn it, if they didn't pick me to be on this panel, which was interesting because I didn't really know the people that were choosing the panel. I was lured in with the idea that it was going to be 6 weeks. We were going to look at the current policy that was like one sentence long, don't abuse children, basically. And, we were going to make recommendations. So 9 months later, after having to drive to Cleveland twice or 3 times a week, the diocese put in a really pretty comprehensive training, education, and then a policy on what to do. And it was a fascinating experience to go through. They had a couple of lawyers, they had a couple of detectives, they had 2 different victims of sexual abuse, one that came from a very devout family, and then one that came from a much more typical victim that I was used to in the prosecutor's office, came from kind of a chaotic family. And so that was very interesting. And then there was members of the general public, there were some healthcare providers. So it was a very interesting process to go through. Plus, it also reminded my children that I actually was a lawyer, because I'd been at home with them for so long that they had forgotten that I actually used to not be home all the time. And so that was also kind of a gift to remind them of that. The bishop asked us to roll the policy out to the different parishes to explain the policy. And I was unprepared for how hostile the different parishes were, and frankly, the different clergy were, because they were very defensive about the fact that this policy even had to be written. As a lawyer, the Bar Association is the one that polices kind of the lawyers, and we have a pretty assertive group to police our own. So I was a little surprised that the priests in particular didn't understand the need for this. But having said that, the whole process was very, very interesting. From that, however, that experience, I got then hired at the juvenile court. My youngest child was in 1st grade. I am not a TV watcher, so the idea of just staying home and, I don't know, cleaning your house or something was not that interesting to me. So I wanted to go back to work, and I thought I would work at the juvenile court and do the traffic magistrate job, because that was at night. My husband could be home, and I could do that, from 5 to 8 o'clock at night. Unfortunately, Judge Teodosio, who is our juvenile court judge, was aware of the work that I did with Bishop Pillis. So she thought it would be a much better idea if I came on part-time and doing dependency, neglect, abuse work. I will tell you, for those of you that are not familiar with the juvenile court, it is a great place to work, and it is good work. To be my age and doing the work that we do that is so impactful, it is good work. Tying this back into civic engagement, interestingly or not, I have discovered that not everyone likes to work with juveniles, and especially juveniles that are delinquent, which is the term we use for criminals, for criminal work. I find 98% of these kids, delightful is probably too strong of a word, but really pleasant to work with. The kids, so I do about 50% of my work is criminal work, and about 50% is dependency, neglect, abuse work. So dependency, neglect, abuse is when a child's removed from their home on an allegation of dependency, which means that for whatever reason, a parent cannot parent this child. It may be concerns with the parent, or it may be the needs of the child are so high that the parent can't parent them. And then neglect and abuse are pretty much what you would expect neglect and abuse to be. On the delinquency side, I hear mostly the first, second, and third degree felons. The judge hears rape and murder, but then the magistrates hear, like aggravated robbery, aggravated burglary, those kind of things. And the longer I've been there now over 18 years, the more I understand that most of these kids, while they have done bad things, they're not bad kids. Many of them are just knuckleheads. I mean, I don't know a better politically correct word to use. I mean, I can't tell you how many kids come in front of me and don't understand that if you walk into somebody's house and steal their television, that's a burglary. The fact that they didn't lock their door or that they had a welcome mat there doesn't make it any less of a burglary. And these kids literally can't wrap their heads around the fact, why isn't it just a theft? I just stole a TV. Or if they go into a mini mart, a Circle K, and push the clerk while they're stealing beer, that has now become a robbery instead of just a petty theft of beer. And so a lot of the programs we do are cognitive based. We give them thinking skills, because you can actually, just like you practice basketball or just like you practice soccer, you can actually practice thinking skills and role play and make better choices and walk them through different scenarios, and the kids can learn how to make better choices. We also have, and I preside over this, it's called a BHJJ program, which is a therapeutic program where the kids see a therapist at least once a week, sometimes twice a week. They have access to a psychiatric nurse. They have access to Sylvan to help them with educational needs. The reason all these came about is when we started in 2003, the judge tasked us all with a lot of research. And we researched what were common denominators in criminality, in particular, in juveniles. And of course, most people will say it's bad parenting. That's what most people will guess when you ask them. But in fact, the number one indicator of criminality is hanging around with criminal thinking friends. So the research, and we are a research-based court. We're not seat of the pants. We don't do what our grandparents did or what our parents did. Interestingly enough, beating children does not change their behavior. And for those of us that were spanked or whatever, interestingly enough, they'll do the same behavior the next day. But if you can separate kids from, and I don't mean, remove them from their homes, but if you can help them to make better choices in friends, so that's the one area where the parents really are right. When they don't want you to play with Johnny because Johnny's a bad influence, they're actually right. Delinquent kids, if you put them in detention, if I put a little shoplifter in detention to teach him a lesson, and I put him in, because we've got like 3 murderers sitting in detention right now, I put him in with those kids, the shoplifter's not going to get better. And he's not going to make the murderer better, right? So you've just given him a bad friend. So we learned early on not to mix the misdemeanants with the felons. We learned early on that the more we can keep kids away from court, the better their outcomes are. So we do a lot of diversion where the kids never even come into the court. They do programs in the community. I analogize a lot of it to speeding tickets for those of you, not me, but I do see my husband's on here. But for those of you that have gotten speeding tickets or gone through a red light, often just being pulled over is enough embarrassment, or should be enough embarrassment, enough upset of your day that you may not engage in that behavior again. Well, we see that with the kids too. I mean, you get a shoplifter, the first thing that happens if they shoplift at Macy's is they have to call their parents and tell them they just got arrested because they shoplifted. Then they have to drive home in that car with that parent. I'm sometimes afraid for these kids when they have to get in a car with their parents after this. And then they have to come to court, and then they have the magistrate yell at them. And then so a lot of times just getting caught for these kids, they're never going to do this behavior again. So it's a little bit overkill, to put them in detention. But I will tell you, most people, when you ask them what should happen to these kids, they all think they should be locked up. They think, that they should be scared straight, but the research never backs up scared straight. There's no research. There's no good research that says that that's an effective program. So we follow the research. We try not to put the kids in detention if we can help it. We have a lot of partners in the community that we use to give these kids pro-social activities. I will tell you, these kids that come in front of me, I have no idea if they've eaten on the day I see them. I have no idea if someone hit them before they came to see me. I have no idea. I've had 4 kids on my caseload shot since January. 1 kid shot twice. These are their lives. I mean, I can say to them all day long, you need to stop carrying guns because you're carrying a gun, because the next door neighbor's carrying a gun, but he's carrying a gun because you're carrying a gun. But these are the neighborhoods they're living in. This is their reality. I mean, I have one poor kid on my caseload who has lost 3 siblings. One 8-year-old girl shot at a birthday party, an infant that died, a SIDS death, and then another sibling who was hit by a car, actually a fire truck. I can't tell you how many kids I have on my caseload that only have one parent, that a parent is deceased either through, whatever, but a lot of them through drug, alcohol issues, through mental health. 80% of the kids that touch our detention unit have some mental health diagnosis. We have a lot of dual diagnosed kids that have both mental health and substance abuse. We have the human trafficking docket where, the kids that are at high risk or have been human trafficked, we have a special docket for that with special services. We assess the kids as they come into detention for mental health, for substance abuse, for trauma, for human trafficking, for cognitive issues, and then so that we have this information when we're trying to deal with them. Some, like I said, the longer I'm there, the more empathetic I really am for these kids and their families, because I had 5 brothers, as I said, and an older sister who watched out for me. I'm 6 out of 7. I never remember being alone at night, ever. My parents didn't go out very much, but even with that, I had all these brothers and sisters. Somebody walked me to school every day. Somebody walked me home. I can't really remember being afraid as a kid. The kids we deal with, they're afraid all the time. They are alone a lot through no fault of their own, and often through no fault of the parent who is trying to support these kids. They're in unsafe neighborhoods. And I guess what I would ask from all of you is that when you think of these kids, think of what you'd want for your own kid in this situation. And also remember that none of us want to be judged on our 15-year-old selves, because all of us have stories of things that we got away with. when we were young. And, you know, I remember one story of a police officer stopping at my house to talk to my parents about something I may or may not have done a day earlier, but also thinking, you know, that's also because they knew my parents, because they'd lived there a long time. I have these 5 brothers. They may have stopped at our house once or twice before and knew us, but they also knew my parents would take care of it too. And they did. But we have these kids that don't always have that same opportunity to just have the police come and talk to the parents, to have the parents talk to the kids, and then they get arrested. And then once, of course, you have one criminal conviction, you're much less likely to have the police counsel you. We used to, you know, when I was in the prosecutor's office, we'd call it a counsel and release, when they just said, hey, knock it off. You know, we know who you are. We know where you live. Stop doing this. The programming that we have now, the specialized programming we have, the specialized dockets we have really put really good services in for these kids: mental health, substance abuse, trauma therapy. And we see the benefit of that on the streets. Since 2009, we made a real push. It's called the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative. We made a real push to partner with a lot of service providers for these kids, so that we can solve or give services to educational deficiencies, you know, a lot of food insecurity. A lot of our kids just need to eat. A lot of these families just need to eat, with employment services, with these therapeutics. And criminality of juveniles has gone down in Summit County 85% since 2009. And this is not just kids that we're not, that we're diverting. These are literal cases that are not being filed. I mean, that's just how much I'm really worried about us all being out of jobs there as magistrates, because, you know, really the delinquency's gone down that much. The same with the dependency, neglect, abuse side. We're really trying to put a lot of services in for the parents so that we can reunify sooner. We believe that if we can get the parents engaged in the process of case planning within the first 90 days, then they have a much higher chance of being reunified with their children. So if we can if the issue is substance abuse, if the issue is mental health, if we can get them engaged in the services. So we now have a dedicated case manager to work with the parents. And I just wanted to read a little list of some of the service providers we use in Summit County, because if you know them, volunteer for them, you know, financially support them, you know, vote for their levies, because the support that you give to our service providers are supports that you're given to these kids in Summit County. And it really does take a village to make these kids successful. And it's in your best interest for them to be successful, because they have access to your kids and your grandkids. I mean, they're the kids they're going to see at the mall. They're the kids they're going to see in downtown Akron at, you know, Lock 3. So we want them to be successful. And even if you just don't intrinsically want it for them, want it for your own families, because the more stable the juveniles are that we work with, the more stable the community is. We work with Catholic Charities of Summit County with mentorship. They also do some of our parenting programs. We work with the Y, who supplies mentors for us. Oriana House does our GPS and electronic monitoring services. We call that, it's like house arrests for adults or juveniles, where we can track monitor them. We work with the International Institute because we are a relocation area, and we have, quite a few ethnic groups in Akron. I will tell you, their criminality is very low. If you compare the neighborhoods in North Hill and some of the other neighborhoods, they represent very small amount of the delinquencies that we see at juvenile court. We work with Community Health Center on substance abuse and mental health treatment. We work with the health department that supplies us with Narcan. Narcan is kind of the EpiPen for a fentanyl or heroin overdose. So if you know anybody that's struggling with fentanyl or heroin, the health department will supply you free of charge with Narcan, and you should have that, because that can save somebody's life. And we actually have those in our courtrooms in case we need them. We work with Akron Public Library on literacy issues. We work with the Village Network and Child Guidance for therapeutic services. Children's Services, of course, we partner with on a lot of cases. The Alcohol, Drug, and Mental Health Board helps us with guidance and funding. Sylvan, we have a grant for Sylvan to provide educational services for some of our kids that are having some deficiencies. We have a parenting project. And I'm sure that I've missed quite a few others that we work with. We have volunteer tutors that come into our court in non-COVID times, but also our detention center to work with the kids. We have a women's board that, puts on the holiday dinners and lunches for the kids. They also have game nights for the kids. And, it's interesting. You have this idea of what you think juvenile delinquents are. And most of these kids look really, like I said, I have 5 brothers. They look really familiar to me. And some of the stuff they've done seems really familiar to me. They're kids that I think if you took out of their environment and took away from their friends, they would have had a really different life, and the community would have. I'm not saying there's not kids out there that are a little bit scary. There clearly are. But the problem with the juvenile brain is it's not fully developed till about age 25, and you're judging these kids on your standards as an adult when their thought processes are very immature and are very short-sighted. They have a hard time thinking past, wouldn't it be a great idea to think about, yeah, but if we do that, there could be really serious consequences. I can't tell you how many kids will say, if I had to do it all over again, which is also a refrain that a lot of adults say. But you take trauma with an adult, you take depression with an adult, you take mental health with an adult, you take, death with an adult. And we at least have the age and wisdom to deal with all those emotions. You put that in a little juvenile brain that doesn't have the age and wisdom and experience to process that. And they act out. I mean, it's why they throw chairs in school. It's why they flip desks over. It's why they, do a lot of stuff. It's not acceptable behavior, but you really got to break it down into small little chunks as to why they're behaving the way they do, and then give them new skills. Very few of these 15-year-olds that throw pumpkins over an overpass are going to be 40-year-olds who throw pumpkins over an overpass. But we've had a death with someone throwing something over an overpass. I mean, we've had a homicide with a BB gun that somebody thought would be fun to shoot at someone. And these are things, literally, but for the grace of God, though many of us as teenagers did, again, this is a legal term, really dumb stuff that thankfully we didn't kill anybody, and we, didn't get caught, or so when you're thinking about these kids you read in the newspaper, just remember they have a whole backstory. They have a whole sad story, usually, of how they got to where they are today. And then we spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out the best way to make sure that we're not seeing that behavior again, and that these kids have a chance to graduate from high school and move on from there. And it's, like I said, it's very rewarding work, because these kids, most of them respond really pretty well to the services and therapies we have available. I was going to end with a quote from chapter 5. Actually, there was 2 I really liked. One is, everything then depends on our ability to see the need for a change of heart, attitude, and lifestyles. I thought that was good. But I also thought the one that said, monologues engage no one, is something I always have to remember when I'm in court, because sometimes I'll go off on these kids and I'll give them a historical version of how, when you buy weed, you're funding terrorists, and they're looking at me like, really? Not in my thought process. So if you have an opportunity ever to stop by juvenile court non-COVID times, you should. It's a great building. It's got a great staff. We have a great judge. If you haven't met her, you should go out of your way to meet her, because she is pretty dynamic. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Rita. And it's also nice to have another Rita.
It is nice to have another Rita. Thank you, Rita. Thank you for all those, wonderful insights, for the good work that you do. Very enlightening hearing this. I'd like to open it up for any thoughts, comments that any of you folks out there have on what we've heard tonight. A lot of good stuff.
I had a little experience today that it just something she just was talking about, Rita. By the way, my 4-year-old granddaughter's named Rita.
It's a great name. It's a family name for me. My mother was Rita, and I have a daughter, Rita. So
anyway, I was downtown this morning at St. Bernard's for Mass. I was the deacon for the Hibernian St. Patrick's Day Mass. And as I was leaving, I drove down Main Street to head back to Barberton. And I see a panhandler in a wheelchair out in the corner of Thornton and Main. And I had a feeling it was somebody I might know. So I went back around the block and parked in Aldi's and got out of the car, and I walked over. I couldn't believe it. It was a guy I played football with and wrestling with in high school. Yeah, we graduated in 1971 from Barberton. He was probably the most popular guy in our class. I mean, everybody loved Freddie. And I heard stories that after high school, he went off to Vietnam for a couple tours. And after that, his life was just a life full of, drugs and alcohol and crime. And so I did a little research on him. My wife and I are in charge of our 50th class reunion, and we had heard that he died. And I said, I don't think he died. I think he's still out there, and I'm going to find him, because I don't think he passed away, because we keep a record of all the folks who've died just for, a memorial. And anyway, my brother was a Barberton police officer for 33 years who just passed away. And I asked him before he died, I said, do you remember Fred? He goes, oh yeah. He said, I arrested him plenty of times. And I called the chief of police at Barberton, who's a good friend of mine, and he helped me track him. And I found him a couple of weeks ago, and I went to visit him with another classmate. And I called his court-appointed attorney and his guardian and said, is it all right to go there? Is it safe? Blah, blah, blah. Where's he live? And we found out where he lived. And it was the most wonderful experience of sitting with him. We took our yearbook and we went through the yearbook. We went page by page. It was so wonderful. And, seeing him today, I thought, hey, there he is. And I got out of the car and I walked over to him, and he's sitting there waving his little American flag. And he goes, hey, Adair, thanks for visiting me. When you guys coming back? And all I thought about listening to you, Rita, was, you just don't know what people's baggage is. How can you judge? I was always so callous about these people on the freeways, panhandling and asking. I thought, right away you're like, go get a job. Or who am I to say? There before the grace of God go I, right? I mean, this poor guy, he probably, his military life messed him up, and he never quite recovered, although he's doing quite well. And who am I to judge? It could be any one of us, So it just felt so good to walk up to him, even though he's panhandling today, to know what his background is and what his walk has been, and not to be so dang critical and harsh about it. Just give him some love and give him some time. And maybe that's what this political love is all about. It's like, political love. What the heck is that, right? But
so,
anyway,
I will tell you, every once in a while the kids will say to me, who are you to judge me? And I will say to them, that is literally my job, though.
Yeah,
it's right. Literally my job.
Yeah, you're the judge.
But then
That's
Deacon also sounds like PTSD as well. So that's one thing in terms of mental health and possibly addiction and just the trauma of war and violence and conflict. There's no telling what kind of it. So instead of it being a character flaw, here's what he experienced, and it wounded him, and it's impacted him in really driven his life ever since. And so it takes a tremendous amount of compassion to help reach out to somebody and bring some healing. And that's what, really well done mental health and behavioral health services does, as Andy and Rita and Bernie and others here know, is really good mental health and behavioral health services can bring healing with the. So in chapter 6, as Pope Francis writes about dialogue, he writes about trying to build this culture of encounter. And he says, I've written a lot about promoting this culture of encounter, but he also talks about a dual, meaning a parallel and complementary culture along with it, a culture of encounter and accompaniment. That as church, we're called to not just simply these one-time occasional encounters with people, and not to put any obligation or guilt on you, Deacon, but in some way trying to accompany people, more personally, so that we're actually trying to help lighten their burden a little bit in some way, even if it's somebody we've never met, but based on the policies we're going to support, we're trying to alleviate their burden because we're trying to accompany them. And that's what happens when we actually find, like Rita's mentioning, and the past few weeks have mentioned opportunities that are available in the community that each of the speakers has talked about. But the challenge is for each of us to feel, to discern, how am I feeling called? How have I been gifted and equipped? What are the combination, just the random providence of relationships I've been blessed with that are calling me to respond in this way, to utilize my gifts and place them at the service of whomever or whatever circumstance it might be. And all that's based on the uniqueness of our giftedness. And I mean, what a blessing that you recognized him, and that sounds like that was healing and dignifying for him. That's just anybody recognized him and recognized him as the human being that he was in his better years, to help him reclaim some of his humanity at this time when he's still struggling. So blessings for reaching out to him.
Yeah, thank you. Encounter and accompaniment, two good words to remember. Other thoughts, comments? Well, I think we've heard, just so many good things tonight. The information, the work that's being done. So I think it gives us a lot of things to think about as we continue our reading and as we reflect on the Pope's letter. We'll ask you for the Lectio Divina. The Corinthians 13 reading is a beautiful reading, and really speaks faith, hope, and love, with the greatest being love, as we said. So please be sure to use that in your prayer, maybe this evening or tomorrow, to really reflect on how the Lord is speaking to you in that reading, and what he's calling you to, and the actions that he's calling you to. He's calling all of us to. I think, like Jeff said, encounter and accompaniment. So we encourage you to do that. We encourage you to continue to use the examine, the prayer that we gave, and that spiritual practice that's also very important, very enlightening for us. So to close the evening, why don't we pray the prayer to the Creator, the one that we have been using for our series. So let's bow our heads in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, Father of our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Pour forth into our hearts a fraternal spirit, and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Andy, is there anything you wanted to?
Yeah, just a couple of quick announcements.
Mm-hmm.
Next week, we finish off our 5-week series with Pope Francis So everybody can prepare by looking at the chapters 7 and 8. A reminder is that we're going to be meeting in the church for a final prayer service together. So we'll be there. We'll also be doing the live stream, not by the Zoom link, but by like the usual parish live stream link. You just go to the parish website and you can find when we're starting. And then again, there's lots of good resources in here about things we've talked about. Wonderful, very short video on dialogue by a guy named Raymond Panikar. It's only about 4 minutes. And Bishop Barron on the common good. And a wonderful video on the life called Sister, the life and ministry of Sister Catherine Walsh, one of our own from the Akron area. It's about a half hour. It's a wonderful, locally done film. Take a look in your guide, or if you need any help, just send us an email. That's all I have.
Thank you, everyone. Wonderful to see you, Jeff. Rita, thank you so much. Thank you for being with us this evening. Thank you, everyone. Have a really good rest of the day. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday in church. God bless.